The woman hit the ground like a fallen monument, 61 years of survival collapsing into dust. Eleanor Hayes had walked into Carson Ridge with $11 and a telegram that shattered her last hope. Her nephew, gone, vanished. The final thread connecting her to family, to purpose, severed. Now she lay in the street while boots shuffled past, while whispers painted her as drunk, diseased, discarded. She wasn't any of those things. She was simply broken. But in that moment of absolute surrender, when the world had written her final chapter, a calloused hand grabbed her collar and hauled her upright. "Get up!" a voice snarled. "You don't get to die in front of my diner." If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. And if this beginning grabbed you, hit that like button. You're going to need to remember this moment when everything changes. The sun beat down on Carson Ridge like a punishment, turning the unpaved main street into a ribbon of choking dust that clung to everything. Buildings, horses, people. It was the kind of heat that made breathing feel like work, that turned ambition into exhaustion before noon. Eleanor Hayes had been walking since dawn, each step heavier than the last, the telegram in her coat pocket growing damp with sweat despite the dry air. She'd read it 17 times on the train from Denver. 17 times, as if repetition might change the words, might rearrange them into something bearable. James Hayes. Whereabouts unknown, stop, boarding house abandoned, stop, debts unpaid, stop, inquiries cease, stop. Her nephew. 23 years old, the boy she'd raised after his mother died, her sister Margaret, the last person who'd shared her blood and her memories. James had been wild, reckless, prone to schemes that glittered like fool's gold, but he'd been hers. He'd promised to write. He'd promised to send for her once he'd made something of himself in the Colorado Silver Towns. 6 months of silence, and now this. Eleanor stopped in the middle of the street, swaying. The telegram slipped from her fingers, caught by a gust of wind that carried it tumbling toward a horse trough. She didn't chase it. What would be the point? The words were branded into her memory now, permanent as scars. Around her, Carson Ridge conducted its afternoon business with the indifference of a place that had seen too much hardship to notice one more. A wagon rattled past, the driver not even glancing her way. 2 women in faded calico dresses crossed to the opposite boardwalk, their conversation not pausing. A dog nosed through garbage behind the general store. Eleanor's vision narrowed to a tunnel, dark at the edges. Her knees buckled. She thought of her husband, dead 12 years from pneumonia. She thought of Margaret, wasted by consumption. She thought of her parents, her stillborn daughter, her brother killed in the war. She thought of the boarding house she'd sold in St. Louis to pay James's gambling debts, the one thing she'd owned after 40 years of scrubbing floors and mending clothes and making do with less. All of it, everyone, gone. The ground rose up to meet her, or she fell to meet it. The distinction didn't matter. Her cheek pressed against dirt that smelled of horse manure and dried mud. Someone shouted, but the voice seemed to come from very far away, from another world where people still cared about strangers collapsing in the street. Darkness pulled at her, soft and welcoming. "Oh, for the love of, move, get out of the way!" The voice cut through the fog like a blade. Eleanor felt hands on her, rough but not unkind, hauling her up by the armpits, her head lolled, boots dragging furrows in the dust. "She drunk?" a man's voice asked. "Does she smell drunk, you idiot?" "She's starved, maybe sick. Either way, she's not dying in front of my establishment, scaring off customers." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open to see a woman's face inches from her own. 50, maybe 55, with steel gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin, and eyes that burned with an intensity that allowed no argument. A food-stained apron covered a dress that had seen better years. "Can you hear me?" the woman demanded. Eleanor managed a nod, though it felt like her head was filled with wet sand. "Good. Can you walk?" I think... That's a no. Frank, stop gawking and help me get her inside." A younger man appeared, gangly and uncertain, taking Eleanor's other arm. Together they half-carried, half-dragged her across the boardwalk and through a door that announced Murphy's Diner in peeling paint. The smell of bacon grease and coffee hit Eleanor's senses like a revival, making her stomach clench with violent hunger she'd been ignoring for 2 days. They deposited her in a chair at a corner table, and the woman, Murphy, presumably, disappeared into the back. The few other diners stared openly. Eleanor tried to sit upright, to maintain some dignity, but her spine felt like water. Her dress, once a respectable gray wool, was coated in dust. Her hair, pinned that morning with care, had come loose in gray tangles. She was 61 years old and looked every minute of it. Murphy returned with a bowl of beef stew, steam rising from it in wisps that made Eleanor's eyes water. A thick slice of bread, butter already melting into its pores. A cup of coffee so strong the spoon practically stood upright in it. "Eat," Murphy commanded. I don't have enough to... Did I ask you for money? Eat. Slowly, or you'll just bring it back up, and I'm not cleaning that. Eleanor stared at the food, then at the woman, searching for the angle, the price, the inevitable demand. People didn't give without expecting return. She'd learned that truth over and over, carved it into her bones through decades of disappointment. Murphy crossed her arms. "You planning to admire it or eat it? Because it's getting cold, and cold stew is an insult to the cow that died for it." Eleanor picked up the spoon with a trembling hand. The first bite hit her tongue. Salt, meat, vegetables that had been simmered into tenderness. Her throat closed up, not from the food, but from the unexpected mercy of it. Tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the dust on her face to create pale tracks. "Easy," Murphy said, her voice dropping a register, losing some of its sharp edge. "Small bites." Eleanor obeyed, forcing herself to eat slowly, even though every cell in her body screamed for her to devour it all at once. She hadn't realized how hungry she was, how the gnawing in her stomach had become just another pain to endure. When had she last eaten? Yesterday morning? The day before? Murphy pulled out the chair across from her and sat, studying Eleanor with eyes that missed nothing. Around them, the other diners gradually lost interest, returning to their own meals and conversations. "You got a name?" Murphy asked. "Eleanor Hayes." "Well, Eleanor Hayes, I'm Josephine Murphy, but everyone calls me Joe. You got people in Carson Ridge?" Eleanor shook her head, swallowing another spoonful of stew. "No. No people anymore." "That's so." Joe's eyebrows lifted. "Came here for a reason, though. Nobody ends up in Carson Ridge by accident. It's not on the way to anywhere worth going." The bread was transcendent, yeasty and rich. Eleanor took her time with it, buying seconds to decide how much truth to tell. In the end, exhaustion made the choice for her. She was too tired for lies. "My nephew, James Hayes, he was supposed to be here, or near here, working a claim or something. I got a telegram." She gestured vaguely toward the street where the paper had blown away. "He's gone, disappeared. I came to find him, and he's just gone." Joe's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or pity. "James Hayes, skinny kid, talked a lot about striking it rich?" Eleanor's heart jumped. "You knew him?" "Knew of him. He passed through here about 8 months back. Stayed a week, ate 3 meals on credit he never paid, then rode out saying he'd found investors for some silver claim up in the hills. That's the last anyone saw of him." 8 months. Eleanor had been writing letters to an empty boarding house, waiting for responses that would never come, while James had already moved on to his next scheme. "He was always like that," Eleanor said softly. "Always chasing the next big opportunity. His mother was the same way. My sister Margaret. She married a gambler, died poor. She finished the stew, scraping the bowl clean without shame. I thought I could save him from that. Raised him after she passed. Tried to teach him the value of steady work, honest living. He'd nod and agree and then do exactly what he wanted anyway." "Kids have a way of doing that," Joe said, "even when they're not kids anymore." Eleanor met her eyes. "You have children?" "Had a daughter. Died of scarlet fever at 6. Joe's voice was flat, factual, but her fingers drummed once against the table, a tell of old grief. "Long time ago now. Anyway, point is, you can't save people from themselves. You can love them, you can guide them, but if they're determined to be fools, that's their choice to make." Wise words from someone who just fed a stranger for free. A ghost of a smile touched Joe's lips. Feeding you isn't saving you, it's just feeding you. There's a difference. She leaned back, the chair creaking under her weight. So what's your plan now? You got money for a room? Eleanor pulled out the bills from her pocket, smoothing them on the table. $11. A fortune once, now barely enough for a week of cheap lodging and meals. This is what I have. I was going to find James, and he was going to… I don't know. I thought he'd help me. I thought maybe we could start over together. She laughed, a broken sound. Stupid, he's 23. Why would he want his old aunt hanging around? You're not that old. I'm 61, Joe. That's old for a woman with nothing to her name. Too old for factory work. Too old for most people to bother with. I'm not useful anymore. Bullshit. The word cracked like a whip. You walked into this town on your own 2 feet. You're coherent, clean, and from the way you're holding that spoon, you've got manners and education. You're not used to begging. So what did you do before you came chasing after that worthless nephew of yours? Eleanor blinked at the directness of it. I ran a boarding house in St. Louis for 18 years. I cooked, cleaned, kept the books, managed repairs. Before that, I was a seamstress. Before that, I helped my husband run a general store until he died. So you can cook, sew, manage money, and keep a house running. Those are skills, Eleanor. Useful ones. They're women's work, common work. There's 100 women in this town who can do the same. Then you'll have to be better than them. Joe stood up, collecting the empty bowl. There's a room above the diner. It's small, but it's got a bed and a lock on the door. You can stay there tonight, work off the cost by helping in the kitchen tomorrow. After that, we'll see. Eleanor stared up at her. Why are you doing this? Because someone did it for me once when I ended up in a strange town with nothing. And because… Joe paused, something vulnerable crossing her face before she locked it away. Because I'm tired of watching people give up. This country chews people up and spits them out, and most folks just accept it. But you got fight in you still. I saw it when you were eating. You didn't quit, even when you were crying, so don't quit now. The words settled into Eleanor like seeds into soil, fragile but there. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Joe led her through the kitchen, where a young Chinese cook named Lin looked up from a pot of beans and nodded once, his face carefully neutral. Then up a narrow staircase to a room that was indeed small, barely space for the iron-frame bed, a washstand, and a trunk. But it was clean. The window looked out over the street, and evening light slanted through the glass in golden bars. Privy's out back, pumps in the kitchen. I expect you down at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. Joe moved toward the door, then stopped. You religious, Eleanor? I was. Lost the habit after my daughter was born dead. Good. I can't abide preachy women. We clear on that? Crystal clear? When Joe left, Eleanor sat on the bed, feeling the mattress give beneath her weight. Real straw, not just rags. The luxury of it made her want to weep again. Instead, she unlaced her boots, worn through at the sole, and lay back, still fully dressed, staring at the ceiling where someone had painted stars. Crude constellations that didn't match the real sky, but beautiful anyway in their optimism. She thought about James, probably dead in a mine somewhere, or shot over a card game. She thought about Margaret, and how they used to lie in bed as girls, whispering about the lives they'd have, the men they'd marry, the children who would surround them. Neither of them had imagined this. Solitary survival, everyone they'd loved reduced to memories. But tomorrow, she would wake up. She would go downstairs and work. She would earn her keep. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a reason to keep breathing that didn't depend on someone else's existence. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. Eleanor woke to pitch darkness and the sound of boots on stairs. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The mattress was wrong. The smell was wrong. Everything was wrong. Then memory crashed back. Carson Ridge, Joe. The stew. James gone. A knock on the door. 5 o'clock, Eleanor. Kitchen's waiting. She dressed in the dark, her fingers fumbling with buttons and laces. Her body ached from the previous day's travel, and her head felt stuffed with cotton. But she'd made a bargain, and Eleanor Hayes kept her word. The kitchen was already hot when she descended, Lynn working over the stove with the efficiency of a man who'd performed the same motions 10,000 times. He glanced at her, nodded toward a pile of potatoes and a knife. "Peel," he said. His English was accented but clear. No eyes, no brown spots, fast but not wasteful. Eleanor took up the knife, grateful for a task she knew. Her hands remembered the motion from decades of boarding house breakfasts, and soon potato skins fell in long curls, bare white flesh emerging beneath. Lynn worked beside her in silence, chopping onions with mechanical precision. Joe appeared as the first light grayed the windows, looking no different than she had the night before, as if she'd simply materialized fully dressed and alert. She inspected Eleanor's work without comment, then pushed a crate of eggs toward her. "We serve breakfast from 6 to 9. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, gravy. You cook eggs?" 12 different ways. Show me your scrambled." Eleanor cracked eggs into a bowl, 2 dozen, beaten with a splash of milk and a pinch of salt. Lynn had already set a pan to heat, bacon grease shimmering. She poured, letting the eggs set at the edges before stirring gently, keeping them soft. When they were just past wet but not yet dry, she slid them onto a plate. Joe took a fork, tasted, chewed thoughtfully. "Not bad. A little more salt, but you've got the texture right. Most people murder eggs, rubber or soup, nothing in between." She handed the plate to Lynn, who tried them and gave the smallest nod of approval. "You'll do eggs. Lynn handles the bacon and biscuits. I work the floor. We got 10 tables, and on a good morning, we fill most of them. Move fast, stay clean. Don't sass the customers even when they deserve it. Clear?" "Clear." The first customer arrived at 6:15, a rancher with sun-carved wrinkles and hands like leather. Then 2 cowboys, fresh off night watch and reeking of cattle. Then a clerk from the general store, a lawyer in a suit too fine for Carson Ridge, a widow with 3 small children who scraped their pennies together for shared plates. Eleanor cooked. She cooked until her shoulders burned and sweat soaked through her dress. She cooked through the breakfast rush, through the lull, through the second wave of late risers. Eggs, endless eggs, and the occasional request for something special. An omelet with cheese, eggs fried hard, eggs poached in coffee for a man with a hangover. Lynn worked beside her with the same silent efficiency, but she caught him watching her now and then, assessing. When she reached for a pan that was too hot and jerked back, he handed her a rag without a word. When she couldn't find the pepper, he pointed with his chin. By 9 o'clock, the rush was over. Eleanor's hands trembled with exhaustion. Joe appeared in the kitchen with a plate, eggs, bacon, 2 biscuits drowning in gravy. "Eat! You earned it!" Eleanor sank onto a stool, every muscle protesting. The food tasted like victory. Lynn served himself a smaller portion and leaned against the counter, the closest she'd seen him come to relaxing. "You worked before," he said. Not a question. 18 years running a boarding house. This is louder, but the principle's the same. "You fast. Good hands." Coming from Lynn, it sounded like high praise. Jo poured herself coffee, leaning against the doorframe. "You can stay another night. Same deal. Work for your room and board. But Eleanor, I need to be straight with you. I can't afford to hire full-time help. The diner makes enough to keep me and Lynn fed, but not much more. You can work here for a week, maybe 2, but then you're going to need to find something else." Eleanor had expected this. Charity had its limits. "I understand. I'll ask around. Maybe one of the boarding houses needs help, or you could marry." The words hung in the air like a bad joke. Eleanor stared at Joe, waiting for the punchline. Joe didn't smile. "I'm serious. You're presentable when you're cleaned up. You've got skills, and you're past childbearing age, which means you're not a risk. There's men in this territory who'd value a woman who can manage a household. Widowers, mostly. Ranchers who are tired of their own cooking. It's not romantic, but it's practical. I'm 61 years old. And there are men in their 60s and 70s who need wives. The frontier's not picky, Eleanor. It kills women faster than men. Childbirth, accidents, disease. That leaves a lot of lonely men and not enough women to go around." Jo sipped her coffee. "I'm not saying it's your only option, but it's an option. Better than starving." Eleanor set down her fork, appetite gone. "I was married for 22 years. When he died, I was relieved. Is that terrible? He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He was just there, taking up space, expecting things. I swore I'd never do that again." So don't. Marry someone different. Or don't marry at all. Like I said, it's just an option. Joe's expression softened slightly. Look, I'm not trying to push you into anything. I'm trying to be realistic. You've got maybe 2 weeks to figure out how you're going to survive in Carson Ridge, or you need to move on to another town and try your luck there. Those are the facts. Lynn spoke up, his voice quiet. Church has widow fund. Maybe ask. Joe snorted. The church fund is $3 and a prayer. Won't get her through winter. Eleanor looked between them, these two near strangers who were trying, in their blunt way, to help her. I appreciate the honesty, both of you. And Joe, I appreciate the work. I'll figure something out. But as she washed dishes in the basin later, she wondered what exactly she would figure out. Her options felt like doors closing one by one, until she'd be left in a room with no windows and no light. By the third day, Eleanor had fallen into the rhythm of the diner. Wake before dawn, dress in the same 2 dresses she owned, alternating them, sponging away the worst of the stains. Down to the kitchen where Lynn already had coffee brewing. Peel potatoes, crack eggs, cook until her feet screamed for mercy. Eat whatever was left over, collapse into bed. It was grueling. It was also strangely comforting. The work didn't allow time for thinking, for remembering, for mourning. Her hands were too busy to hold grief. The customers began to recognize her. The rancher with the leather hands, she learned his name was Colson, always ordered his eggs over easy and left an extra nickel. The widow with 3 children came twice more, and Eleanor slipped the smallest child an extra biscuit when Joe wasn't looking. On the 4th morning, a man Eleanor hadn't seen before took a corner table. He was older, somewhere in his 60s, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from oak and left to weather. He wore clean work clothes, not fancy but well-maintained, and his boots were broken in but not falling apart. When Joe brought him coffee, he thanked her by name. Thomas, Joe said, surprise in her voice. Didn't expect to see you until Friday. Needed supplies. Thought I'd eat something I didn't have to cook myself for a change. His voice was low, measured, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. The usual? Please. Joe relayed the order to Eleanor. Eggs scrambled, bacon crisp, biscuits, no gravy. Eleanor prepared it with the care she gave every plate, because she'd learned early that Lynn noticed, and Lynn's approval mattered more than she'd expected. When she brought the plate out, the man, Thomas, looked up at her with eyes that were startlingly blue in his weathered face. You're new. Started a few days ago. Eleanor Hayes, Thomas Calder. He offered his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, she shook it. His palm was calloused, his grip firm but brief. You cook these? I did. They're good, better than Joe usually manages. He said it loud enough for Joe to hear, and Joe swatted him with her towel from across the room. Eat your breakfast and hush, Thomas. A small smile touched his mouth, then disappeared. He ate methodically, without hurry, pausing occasionally to drink his coffee. Eleanor returned to the kitchen, but she found herself glancing through the serving window, watching him. There was something about the way he occupied space, not demanding attention, but not shrinking from it either. Solid. That was the word. He seemed solid in a way most people didn't, as if the wind could blow all day and not move him an inch. When he finished, he left exact change on the table, including a tip that was neither generous nor stingy, just fair. He nodded to Joe on his way out, and Joe watched him go with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Who is he? Eleanor asked when she came to clear the table. Thomas Calder. Owns a ranch about 5 miles north of town. Been here 15 years, keeps to himself mostly. Good man, though, honest, fair to his workers. Joe paused. His wife died 3 years ago. Cancer. He's been alone since. Something in her tone made Eleanor look up sharply. Why are you telling me this? No reason, just making conversation. But Joe's eyes held a gleam that made Eleanor's stomach drop. Joe, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying he's a widower. He's got a ranch that's getting harder to manage alone, and he just complimented your eggs. That's all I'm saying. That's quite a lot to not be saying, Joe grinned, unrepentant. Welcome to the frontier, Eleanor. We're all matchmakers here. Not much else to do for entertainment. Eleanor shook her head, but she couldn't quite suppress a smile. It was ridiculous. The man had eaten breakfast, not proposed marriage. Still, she found herself thinking about those blue eyes, that solid presence, even as she scrubbed plates and prepared for the lunch rush. Ridiculous. Sad. Thomas Calder returned 2 days later. Same table, same order. This time when Eleanor brought his plate, he said, "Joe tells me you're looking for work." Eleanor's hands tightened on the tray. "I am. Do you know of something?" "Possibly. My ranch foreman's wife does the cooking and housekeeping, but she's expecting a baby soon and won't be able to keep up with it all. I could use someone to help." "Temporary, at least through her confinement." Hope flared, bright and painful. "I can cook, clean, manage a household. I ran a boarding house for 18 years. Joe mentioned. He cut into his eggs, methodical as before. "It's hard work. The ranch house is big, and it's just me and the foreman's family living there now. My son—" He paused, something crossing his face. "My son lives elsewhere. You'd have your own room, meals provided, and wages. $30 a month." $30. Eleanor's mind raced. It was fair, maybe even generous for household work. It was survival. "I'm interested," she said carefully. "But I'd want to meet the foreman's wife first, make sure we'd work well together." Thomas nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. "Her name is Clara. She and Ben, that's my foreman, live in the house with me. They're good people. Young, but good." He finished his eggs and reached for his coffee. "I'll be in town again Friday. If you want to see the ranch, ride out with me then. You can meet Clara, see the setup, decide if it suits you." "All right, Friday." He left the same tip as before, the same nod to Joe, and walked out with that unhurried gait that suggested a man comfortable in his own skin. Joe appeared at Eleanor's elbow the moment the door closed. "Well?" "He offered me a job, housekeeping on his ranch." "I knew it. I knew Thomas wouldn't come to town twice in 1 week unless he needed a housekeeper," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "That's all this is, Joe. Practical, not romantic." "Practical can turn into something else. I'm 61 years old, Joe. I'm past the age of fairy tales." But that night, lying in her small room above the diner, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of something that felt dangerously close to hope. Not for romance, that was foolish, but for stability, for a place to be, for work that mattered. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Friday dawned clear and cold, the first real bite of autumn in the air. Eleanor dressed in her best dress, which was still shabby, but at least clean, and braided her gray hair into a coronet that made her look, if not young, at least dignified. She packed her few belongings into a carpet bag that had traveled with her from St. Louis, just in case. Thomas arrived at 9 o'clock in a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He helped Eleanor up to the seat with a hand that was steady and impersonal, then clicked his tongue to set the horses moving. The ride north took them out of Carson Ridge's dusty sprawl and into rolling hills covered in dry grass that whispered in the wind. Cattle dotted the landscape, red and brown shapes against the gold. Mountains rose in the distance, purple with haze. Thomas didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. He pointed out landmarks, a creek that ran year-round, the boundary of his property, a stand of cottonwoods where his wife used to picnic. His voice when he mentioned her was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor heard the grief underneath, old and worn smooth like river stones. "What was her name?" Eleanor asked. "Catherine. Kathy, mostly." A pause. "She would have liked you." "You don't know me." "I know you cook good eggs and you're not afraid of hard work. That would have been enough for Kathy." He glanced at her, that brief blue gaze. "She was practical. Said I needed someone practical after she was gone, not some young fool who'd try to change everything." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The ranch house appeared after 40 minutes of travel, a sprawling structure of wood and stone that had clearly been built in stages, additions tacked on as needed. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid, with a wide porch and windows that gleamed in the morning sun. Behind it stood a barn, corrals, several smaller outbuildings. A young woman emerged from the house as the wagon pulled up. Clara, obviously, heavily pregnant and moving with the careful waddle of someone in their final trimester. She had a kind face, round and freckled, and eyes that assessed Eleanor with frank curiosity. "Clara," Thomas said, climbing down from the wagon. "This is Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor, my foreman's wife, Clara Mitchell." "Pleased to meet you," Clara said, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Thomas said you might be able to help with the house. Lord knows I could use it. I can barely bend over to pick up anything anymore, and the baby's not due for another month." Eleanor climbed down, accepting Thomas's hand automatically. "I've run a boarding house. I'm used to cooking for groups and keeping things clean. Can you do laundry? Because that's what's killing me. Ben goes through shirts like they're made of paper, and Thomas isn't much better." "I can do laundry." Clara's face lit up. "You're hired. I don't care what Thomas is paying you, it's not enough." She looped her arm through Eleanor's as if they were old friends. "Come inside. I'll show you around, and you can tell me if you think you can stand us." The house was indeed large, a central living area with a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, a kitchen that opened onto a dining room, 4 bedrooms upstairs, and the foreman's quarters on the ground floor. It was clean but cluttered, the accumulation of 3 years of grief and 2 people doing their best to maintain a space meant for more. Clara showed Eleanor everything with a running commentary about what worked and what didn't, which floorboards squeaked, where the mice got in during winter, how the stove ran hot on the left side. She was cheerful and blunt in equal measure, the kind of person who said exactly what she thought and expected you to do the same. "Thomas is quiet," Clara explained as they toured the kitchen. "Don't mistake it for unfriendly. He's been lonely since Kathy died. Ben and I do our best, but it's not the same as having a partner, you know? Someone to share the load with." Eleanor ran her hand over the kitchen table, solid oak scarred with use. "I'm here to work, Clara. Not to replace anyone." "I know, but maybe—" Clara stopped herself, shaking her head. "Never mind. Ignore me. I'm pregnant and meddlesome. Ben says it's a dangerous combination." They found Thomas in the barn with Ben, a lean young man with sun-bleached hair and the easy confidence of someone who knew his worth. He shook Eleanor's hand with genuine warmth. "Clara's been complaining about the laundry for weeks," he said. "If you can take that off her plate, you'll be her favorite person in the world." "Second favorite," Clara corrected. "You're still first, barely." The affection between them was obvious, the kind of partnership built on respect and shared labor. It made Eleanor's chest ache with something she couldn't name. Thomas walked her through the expectations: help with cooking and cleaning, laundry weekly, preserving when the harvest came in. The room would be hers, on the second floor with a view of the mountains, $30 a month, paid on the first. Sundays off, though she could attend the cooking if she wanted, since Clara wouldn't be able to stand for long periods much longer. "Does this work for you?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked at the house, the barn, the land stretching away in all directions. She thought about the diner room, generous as it was. She thought about her $11, dwindling to $7. She thought about winter coming and nowhere to go. "It works," she said. "When do you want me to start?" "Today, if you're willing. I can drive you back to town to get your things." "My things are in the wagon." Something that might have been respect crossed Thomas's face. "All right then. Today it is." And just like that, Eleanor Hayes found herself with a place to be. Not a home. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But a place. A purpose. It was more than she'd had in Carson Ridge's dusty street, more than she'd had in months. It was enough. Eleanor's first week at the Calder ranch passed in a blur of motion and muscle memory. She woke before dawn to the sound of roosters and started the stove while Clara slept in, her swollen ankles propped on pillows. By the time Ben and Thomas came in from morning chores, breakfast was ready. Eggs, bacon, flapjacks, coffee strong enough to strip paint. She washed dishes, swept floors, beat rugs until dust clouds rose like small storms. She learned the rhythms of the house, where Thomas kept his papers, how Ben liked his shirt starched, the way Clara craved pickles at odd hours. The work was relentless, but it was honest. Her hands remembered every motion from her boarding house days, and her body, though it protested the long hours, adapted. By the 4th day, she could carry 2 buckets of water from the pump without stopping to rest. By the 7th, she'd reorganized the pantry, and Clara had nearly wept with gratitude. "You're a miracle," Clara said, watching Eleanor jar the last of the tomatoes from the garden. "An absolute miracle. I was drowning before you came." Eleanor wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. You were managing. You just needed help. I was failing. There's a difference. Clara shifted in her chair, trying to find a position that didn't make her back ache. Thomas sees it too. He's been different since you arrived. Lighter, somehow. He's just relieved the house isn't falling apart. Maybe. Clara's smile suggested she thought otherwise, but she let it drop. Thomas himself remained largely invisible during daylight hours, out on the range with Ben checking fences, moving cattle, preparing for winter. But he appeared punctually for meals, ate without complaint, and occasionally offered a quiet thank you that carried more weight than longer speeches. Eleanor found herself watching for those moments, those brief acknowledgments that her work mattered. On Sunday, her day off, she woke anyway from habit and discovered Thomas in the kitchen making coffee with the grim determination of a man performing surgery. He looked up when she entered, surprise crossing his weathered face. "Thought you'd sleep in," he said. "Thought I would too. Turns out 61 years of waking early doesn't just stop because someone says you can rest." She took over the coffee operation, adjusting the grounds and water to proper proportions. "You're up early for a Sunday." "Ranch doesn't stop for Sundays. Animals still need tending." He watched her work, then asked, "You settling in all right?" "I am. The room's comfortable. Clara and Ben are easy to work with." "And me?" Eleanor glanced at him, caught off guard by the directness. "You're fine. Quiet, but fine." Kathy used to say I was too quiet. Said it was like living with a well-mannered bear. The corner of his mouth twitched. She talked enough for both of us, though. Balanced things out. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her. Eleanor poured coffee into 2 cups, added sugar to hers, left his black. They sat at the table in companionable silence, watching dawn paint the mountains gold through the kitchen window. "Your nephew," Thomas said after a while. "The one you came looking for. You still hoping to find him?" Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup, feeling its warmth seep into her palms. "I don't know anymore. Part of me wants to know what happened, if he's alive, if he's in trouble. But part of me thinks maybe it's better not to know. Maybe he left because he wanted to leave everything behind, including me. That would be his loss." The words were simple, matter of fact, but they struck something deep in Eleanor's chest. She looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and saw a man who meant exactly what he said. No flattery, no hidden agenda, just truth. "Thank you," she said quietly. They finished their coffee as the house began to stir around them, Clara's footsteps overhead, Ben whistling as he headed to the barn. Thomas stood, rinsed his cup, and paused at the door. "Take your day off, Eleanor. Go to town if you want. Ben can drive you, or just rest. You've earned it." But Eleanor found she didn't want to go to town, didn't want to rest. Instead, she spent the day mending Thomas's shirts, the ones with frayed cuffs and missing buttons that he'd been making do with. It wasn't required work. It was just something that needed doing, and her hands needed to be busy. That evening, when Thomas came in for supper, he noticed the shirts hanging clean and whole on the back of his chair. He didn't say anything, just ran his fingers over one mended cuff, his expression unreadable. But when he sat down to eat, Eleanor saw something in his eyes that looked almost like wonder. The second week brought the first real cold snap, temperatures dropping below freezing overnight. Eleanor woke to find ice on the water basin in her room and her breath misting in the air. She dressed in layers and hurried downstairs to get the fires going, her joints stiff and protesting. Clara's pregnancy had reached the stage where every movement was an ordeal. She couldn't stand for more than 10 minutes without her back seizing, couldn't sleep lying down because of heartburn, couldn't keep food down in the mornings. Eleanor took over the kitchen entirely, bringing Clara meals in bed, making sure she rested. "I feel useless," Clara complained one afternoon, watching Eleanor knead bread dough with methodical efficiency. "You're growing a human being. That's not useless. Ben thinks I should stay in bed until the baby comes. Thomas agrees with him, but I can't just lie there doing nothing. I'll lose my mind." Eleanor shaped the dough into loaves, covering them with clean towels to rise. "So don't do nothing. Sit here and talk to me while I work. Tell me about how you and Ben met." Clara's face lit up the way it always did when she talked about her husband. "We met at a church social in Denver. I was serving punch, and he spilled an entire cup down his shirt trying to impress me. Stood there dripping and red-faced, stammering apologies. I laughed so hard I snorted, which made him laugh, and that was it. We were married 3 months later. 3 months? That's quick. When you know, you know. Besides, Ben had already accepted the foreman position here, and I wasn't about to let him leave without me. She shifted, trying to ease the pressure on her lower back. Thomas and Kathy took us in like family. This was supposed to be temporary, just until we saved enough for our own place. But then Kathy got sick and everything changed. Thomas needed us, and we needed to be needed. So we stayed. What was Kathy like? Clara's smile turned wistful. Strong, funny. She could outwork any man on this ranch and still have energy to throw a dinner party. She loved this place, loved Thomas, loved life even when it was hard. The cancer took her fast, 6 months from diagnosis to death. She made Thomas promise he wouldn't shut down, wouldn't let the ranch fall apart, wouldn't die alone in this house. He's kept 2 of those promises. Eleanor understood what wasn't being said. And you think I'm here to help with the 3rd? I think you're here because you need work and Thomas needs help. But Eleanor, Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping. I've watched him these past 2 weeks. He smiles more. He lingers at meals. He fixed that loose board on the porch that's been driving me crazy for 6 months. That's not about needing a housekeeper. That's about having a reason to care again. Clara, I'm 61 years old. I'm not looking for romance. Who said anything about romance? I'm talking about partnership, companionship. 2 people making a life less lonely. Clara's eyes were kind but unflinching. Think about it. That's all I'm saying. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about it while scrubbing floors, while hanging laundry that froze stiff on the line, while rolling pie crusts and stirring stew. She thought about Thomas's quiet presence at the table, the way he listened when she spoke, the respect in his voice when he asked her opinion on household matters. She thought about her own future, the precarious nature of her position. Hired help was always temporary, always expendable. But marriage, at her age, it seemed absurd. The following Saturday, Thomas asked Eleanor to accompany him to town for supplies. Ben needed to stay with Clara, who'd been having false labor pains, and Thomas needed an extra pair of hands to manage the shopping list. They rode in the wagon through morning frost that glittered on every surface like scattered diamonds. Thomas drove with easy competence, the reins loose in his hands, and Eleanor found herself studying his profile. The strong nose, the weathered skin, the silver hair that curled slightly at his collar. He was handsome in the way older men could be, all sharp edges worn smooth by time. "You're staring," Thomas said without looking at her. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was thinking." "About what?" "About how strange life is. 2 months ago, I was in St. Louis selling my boarding house to pay my nephew's debts. Now I'm riding through Colorado with a rancher I barely know, and somehow this feels more real than anything I've done in years." Thomas considered this. "Real how?" "Like it matters. Like what I do here makes a difference, even if it's just cooking breakfast or mending shirts. In St. Louis, I was invisible, just another old woman keeping house. Here, I'm seen. You're more than seen, Eleanor. You're valued." He glanced at her then, those blue eyes direct. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens, you've already made this place better." Whatever happens. The phrase hung between them, weighted with possibility. They reached Carson Ridge and divided the supply list, Eleanor heading to the general store while Thomas arranged for feed delivery. She was comparing flour prices when Joe appeared at her elbow, grinning like a cat with cream. Well, look who's still alive. I was starting to worry Thomas had worked you to death." "He's been perfectly reasonable. Clara's the one I worry about. That baby's going to be huge." "Never mind Clara. Tell me about you and Thomas." Joe waggled her eyebrows suggestively. Living under the same roof, sharing meals, long nights by the fire. "Joe, stop. It's not like that. I work for him, that's all." "For now." Joe lowered her voice, her teasing tone shifting to something more serious. "But Eleanor, you should know Thomas Calder doesn't bring just anyone into his home. After Kathy died, he turned down 3 different women who offered to keep house for him. Said he didn't want strangers touching her things. The fact that he hired you, that he's kept you on, that means something." Eleanor's hand stilled on the flour sack. What are you saying? I'm saying Thomas is a good man who's been alone too long. And you're a good woman who deserves more than just work and wages. I'm saying maybe you should pay attention to what's right in front of you. Before Eleanor could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway, packages balanced in his arms. Ready? Eleanor paid for the flour, avoiding Joe's knowing look, and helped Thomas load the wagon. They drove back in silence, but it was different now, charged with awareness. Eleanor found herself hyper-conscious of the space between them on the wagon seat, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed hers on rough patches of road. Halfway home, Thomas pulled the horses to a stop at an overlook where the land fell away to reveal miles of ranch property stretching to the mountains. The view stole Eleanor's breath. Endless sky, golden grass, cattle like dark punctuation marks across the landscape. I need to tell you something, Thomas said, his hand still on the reins. Clara's baby is due in a few weeks. After that, she'll recover and be able to manage the house again, which means your position here is temporary. We both knew that from the start. Eleanor's stomach dropped. I understand. Let me finish. Thomas turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I could let you go after Clara recovers, send you back to town with a good reference and your wages. That would be the normal thing to do. But I don't want to do that. He took a breath, and Eleanor realized with shock that he was nervous. Thomas Calder, who faced down storms and cattle stampedes without flinching, was nervous talking to her. I want to make you a different offer, one that might seem crazy, but I'm asking you to hear me out. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. I'm listening. I'm 64 years old. I've got a ranch that's getting harder to manage alone, a house that's too big for one person, and winters that are too long and too quiet. I need a partner, Eleanor, not hired help, not someone who'll leave when the season changes, a real partner. He paused, then said the words with careful precision. I'm asking you to marry me. The world seemed to tilt. Eleanor gripped the wagon seat, trying to process what she'd just heard. Marry you? Not for romance, not for anything beyond what makes sense for both of us. You'd have security, a home, a share in the ranch. I'd have someone to help manage things, someone to share the load with. We'd be equal partners in this. Decisions made together, responsibilities divided fairly. You'd keep your own room if you wanted. We'd build this however it works for us. Thomas, before you answer, I need you to understand something. His voice was steady, but his eyes held vulnerability. I loved Kathy. I'm not looking to replace her or pretend what we had didn't matter, but she's gone, and I'm still here, and I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of eating in silence and waking up to empty rooms. I think you understand that feeling. Eleanor did. She understood it in her bones. Why me? She asked. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're honest. I know you work hard without complaining. I know you're kind to Clara, patient with Ben, and you don't try to change things just for the sake of changing them. I know you make the best biscuits I've ever tasted, and you fixed my shirts without being asked, and you haven't once tried to make me into something I'm not. He smiled, just slightly. That's more than a lot of marriages start with. This is insane. Probably. But here's what I'm offering. A trial period. 3 months. You stay on as you have been, but we treat it as a partnership. You learn the ranch business. I'll teach you what I know about managing things. We talk honestly about whether this could work. At the end of 3 months, we decide together. If you want to leave, I'll pay you double wages and give you passage anywhere you want to go. If you want to stay, he held out his hand. We get married and build something together. Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and steady, offering not just marriage but possibility. She thought about her $11, now $7. She thought about winter coming and her options narrowing. She thought about Clara's words about partnership and companionship. She thought about the way Thomas listened, really listened, when she spoke. She thought about waking before dawn in a house that felt more like home than anywhere she'd been in years. Conditions, she said. Thomas's eyebrows lifted. All right. We're equal partners in every way. I won't be decorative or silent. If I have opinions about the ranch, you'll hear them. Agreed. I keep my independence. I won't ask your permission to go to town or visit friends or spend my own money. Agreed. And if at any point this isn't working for either of us, if you resent me or I feel trapped, we end it honestly. No guilt, no recrimination. Agreed. Thomas's hand was still extended. Anything else? Eleanor searched his face, looking for doubt or deception, and finding neither. Just honesty. Just hope. Time. I need time to be sure. The full 3 months, not some rushed decision. You'll have it. 3 months to decide if you can stand me. His smile was genuine now, transforming his serious face into something warmer. Fair warning, I snore, I'm cranky before coffee, and I have opinions about how to stack firewood that some people find unreasonable. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed. The sound surprised her, bubbling up from somewhere she'd thought was empty. I sleep like the dead. I burn everything I bake at least once a week, and I alphabetize the spice cabinet even though no one else can find anything afterward. We're a disaster waiting to happen. Absolutely. Eleanor took his hand, feeling the calluses and the strength and the steadiness. 3 months. 3 months, Thomas agreed. He shook her hand once, formal and binding, then released it. Thank you for considering this. I know it's not conventional. Nothing about my life has been conventional lately. Why start now? They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was comfortable now, settled. Eleanor's mind spun with implications and possibilities, terror and excitement warring in her chest. She was agreeing to consider marriage to a man she'd known for 2 weeks. It was madness. It was practical. It was both. When they reached the ranch, Ben rushed out to meet them, his face tight with worry. Clara's water broke, real labor this time. I need to get the doctor. Thomas was off the wagon in an instant, his entire demeanor shifting to crisis mode. Go. Now. Eleanor, inside. Heat water. Get clean towels. Make sure Clara's comfortable. The next 12 hours blurred into a chaos of boiling water, encouraging words, and Clara's screams that echoed through the house like storms. The doctor arrived and took charge, but he let Eleanor stay, recognizing competent help when he saw it. She held Clara's hand, wiped her forehead, whispered reassurances while Ben paced outside the door, and Thomas waited in grim silence downstairs. The baby came just before dawn, a boy, red-faced and furious, with lungs that announced his arrival to the entire ranch. Clara wept with relief and exhaustion, and Ben stumbled into the room looking like he'd aged 10 years, his hands shaking as he held his son for the first time. Eleanor cleaned up, disposed of the soiled linens, made sure Clara was settled with the baby nursing at her breast. Then she stumbled downstairs to find Thomas still sitting at the kitchen table, exactly where she'd left him hours ago. Boy, she said. Healthy. Clara's fine. Thomas's shoulders dropped with visible relief. Thank you for helping. That's what partners do. The word felt strange in her mouth, weighty. Help each other. He looked at her then, really looked, and Eleanor knew he'd heard what she wasn't quite saying, that she was beginning to think this mad proposal might actually work, that partnership might be exactly what they both needed. Go rest, Thomas said. You've earned it. But Eleanor found herself moving to the stove instead, starting coffee, pulling out the ingredients for breakfast. So have you. You've been sitting there all night. Someone needed to be here, in case... I know. She did know. Thomas was the kind of man who held vigil, who waited through the dark hours, who bore witness to life's hardest moments without flinching. It was one more thing to add to the growing list of reasons this might not be such a terrible idea after all. They ate breakfast as the sun rose, as upstairs Clara and Ben marveled over their son, as the ranch began another day of endless work. And Eleanor thought about the 3 months stretching ahead, about learning to be partners with this quiet, solid man who'd offered her not romance but something potentially more valuable, respect, purpose, and a place to belong. It wasn't everything. But maybe, just maybe, it could be enough. The trial period began the morning after Clara's baby was born, though neither Eleanor nor Thomas spoke of it directly. Thomas simply started including Eleanor in ranch decisions over breakfast, which fields to rotate the cattle through, whether to sell the yearling bulls now or wait for spring prices, how much hay they'd need to get through winter. Eleanor listened, asked questions, and discovered she had opinions about things she'd never considered before. Ben named his son William after his father, and the household reorganized itself around the infant's needs. Clara recovered slowly, her body exhausted from the ordeal, and Eleanor found herself managing not just the house, but the delicate balance of a new mother's emotions. Clara wept at nothing and everything. Burned toast, a misplaced sock, the way sunlight fell across William's face. Eleanor held her through the storms and said nothing, just offered presents and clean handkerchiefs. "I don't know what's wrong with me," Clara sobbed one afternoon, the baby asleep in her arms. "I should be happy. I am happy, but I can't stop crying." "Your body just did something extraordinary. It needs time to settle." Eleanor took William gently, settling him in his cradle so Clara could rest. "This is normal. It passes." "How do you know? You never had—" Clara stopped, horror flooding her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I had a daughter. She was born dead." Eleanor said it calmly, a fact stated without the sharp edges of fresh grief. "I know what it's like when your body remembers what your mind wants to forget. Give yourself grace, Clara. You're doing better than you think." After that, Clara stopped apologizing for her tears, and Eleanor stopped pretending she didn't understand the particular loneliness of women's struggles. 2 weeks into the trial period, Thomas began teaching Eleanor the ranch books. They sat together at his desk in the small office off the living room, ledgers spread between them, and he walked her through income and expenses, profit margins, seasonal fluctuations. Eleanor's boarding house experience served her well. She understood accounts, could spot discrepancies, knew how to stretch a dollar without breaking it. "You're good at this," Thomas said, watching her calculate feed costs in her neat handwriting. "Numbers make sense. They don't lie or change their minds or disappear without warning." Eleanor caught the bitterness in her own voice and softened it. "Sorry, that was about James." "Your nephew. You still think about him?" "Less than I did. Mostly I wonder if he's alive, and if he is, whether he ever thinks about me." She closed the ledger, running her hand over the worn leather cover. "Do you ever hear from your son?" Thomas's expression shuddered. "No." "Clara mentioned you had one." "Richard," she said. "Richard?" The name came out flat, careful. "He's in San Francisco. Has been for 3 years. We don't correspond." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more, but Thomas stood abruptly, gathering the ledgers with hands that weren't quite steady. "It's late. We should get some rest." She didn't push. Everyone had wounds that needed careful handling, and she was learning that Thomas's ran deeper than his weathered surface suggested. The first real test came a week later, when one of the horses, a bay mare Thomas particularly valued, went down in the pasture, thrashing and screaming with colic. Ben found her at dawn and came running to the house, his face pale. "It's Duchess." "She's bad, Thomas. Real bad." Thomas was out the door before Ben finished speaking, Eleanor close behind. They found the mare on her side, sides heaving, eyes rolling white with pain. Thomas knelt beside her, hands moving over her distended belly, his expression grim. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. "Don't know. She was fine last night." "Get the veterinary kit from the barn. Now." Thomas looked up at Eleanor, and she saw fear there, raw and unconcealed. "She's one of Kathy's horses. The last one." "I can't—" "Tell me what to do," Eleanor interrupted. She couldn't fix his grief, but she could help with this. Thomas gave rapid instructions. Eleanor fetched buckets of warm water, clean rags, the medications Thomas kept for emergencies. She held the mare's head while Thomas tried to get her to stand, walking being the best treatment for colic if they could manage it. But Duchess wouldn't rise, just kept thrashing, her breathing labored and desperate. "We're losing her," Ben said quietly. "No." Thomas's voice was steel. "We're not giving up." Eleanor studied the mare, thinking back to her boarding house days and a tenant who'd been a horse trader. He'd talked endlessly about horses while she cooked his meals, boring her with details she'd never expected to need. But memory was a strange thing, and now those tedious conversations surfaced like gifts. "Thomas, does she have a twisted gut?" "Probably. That's what kills them. Nothing we can do about it without surgery, and she'd never survive that." "What if we could untwist it? That trader I knew, he said sometimes you could massage them through it, work the blockage loose from the outside." Thomas looked at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. "Eleanor, that's impossible?" "Maybe. But she's dying anyway. What's the harm in trying?" Something shifted in Thomas's face. "Show me." Eleanor knelt in the dirt beside the thrashing mare, placing her hands on the distended belly. She felt for the tight spots, the places where intestine had knotted, and began to work them with firm circular pressure. The mare screamed and Eleanor nearly stopped, but Thomas's hand covered hers, adding his strength to the massage. "Keep going," he said. "I feel something moving." They worked together, hands slick with sweat despite the cold morning air, muscles burning with effort. Ben held the mare's head, murmuring soothing nonsense. Clara appeared with more water, the baby strapped to her chest. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Eleanor's arms shook with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. And then, like a miracle, Duchess's breathing changed, deepened, steadied. The thrashing slowed, stopped. Her eyes, which had been wild with pain, began to focus. "I'll be damned," Ben whispered. Thomas sat back on his heels, staring at the mare as if she might disappear. Duchess raised her head, ears pricking forward, and let out a soft nicker. "Help me get her up," Thomas said hoarsely. Together they coaxed the mare to her feet. She stood on trembling legs, head hanging low, but she stood, alive. Thomas ran his hands over her neck, her shoulders, his face a battlefield of relief and old grief. "How did you know to do that?" he asked Eleanor. "I didn't. I was guessing." Eleanor's hands were filthy, her dress ruined, her back screaming from the effort. "I just couldn't stand there and watch her die without trying something." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his eyes. Respect, yes, but more than that. Trust. The kind of trust that couldn't be given, only earned through action. "Thank you," he said simply. But that evening, after Duchess had been settled in the barn with careful monitoring, Thomas found Eleanor in the kitchen preparing supper. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work, and when she glanced at him questioningly, he spoke without preamble. "You saved Kathy's horse, the last piece of her that was still breathing. I need you to know what that means to me." Eleanor set down her knife, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm glad I could help." "It's more than help, Eleanor. It's—" He struggled for words, then gave up and just said the truth. "I'm starting to think this partnership might be the smartest thing I've considered in 3 years." Warmth bloomed in Eleanor's chest, unexpected and dangerous. "We're only a month in. You might change your mind." "I might, but I don't think I will." He pushed off from the doorframe. "I'm going to check on Duchess one more time before dinner. Thank you for everything." After he left, Eleanor stood in the kitchen, staring at the vegetables she'd been chopping, trying to understand the feeling spreading through her body. It wasn't love, too soon for that, too old for that, but it was something, possibility maybe, hope, the sense that she was building something that might actually last. The morning after they saved Duchess, a stranger rode up to the ranch just as Eleanor was hanging laundry. He was younger than Thomas by perhaps 10 years, well-dressed in city clothes that looked absurd against the rural backdrop, with dark hair graying at the temples and a face that might have been handsome if not for the sour set of his mouth. "Can I help you?" Eleanor called out, clothespins still in her hand. The man dismounted, studying her with open disdain. "I'm looking for Thomas Calder. This is his ranch, isn't it?" "It is. He's out checking the north fence line. Should be back by noon." "And you are?" Eleanor bristled at his tone, but kept her voice level. "Eleanor Hayes. I manage the household. Can I tell him who's calling?" "Wade Morrison, ranch foreman from the Triple Bar Spread. Tell Calder I'll wait." He tied his horse to the rail and settled onto the porch without invitation, pulling out a cigarette. Eleanor finished hanging the laundry and went inside to tell Ben, who was repairing tack in the living room while Clara nursed William upstairs. Ben's expression darkened when she mentioned Morrison's name. "What's he want?" "Didn't say, just that he'd wait for Thomas." "Nothing good, I guarantee it. Morrison's a snake. Works for Harold Fletcher, who's been trying to buy out smaller ranchers for years. If he's here, it's trouble." Thomas arrived an hour later, and Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Morrison approached him in the yard. Their conversation was brief, tense, punctuated by sharp gestures from Morrison and Thomas's increasingly rigid posture. When Thomas finally walked away, dismissing Morrison without shaking his hand, the The foreman mounted his horse and rode off with a look that promised retribution. Thomas came into the kitchen, his face dark as a thunderstorm. "What did he want?" Eleanor asked. "Fletcher's making another offer on the ranch, bigger this time. Morrison made it sound like a courtesy, but it was a threat. Said times are getting hard, cattle prices dropping, that I should sell while I can still get good money." Thomas poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly. He knows about Clara and Ben having the baby. Knows I'm running this place with less help than I need. He's circling like a vulture. "What did you tell him?" "What I've told Fletcher every time he's asked. No. This ranch was Kathy's dream. We built it together. I'm not selling it to some land baron who'll strip it for profit and move on." Eleanor sat down across from him. "Can you hold out? If prices really are dropping? We're lean, but we're solvent. We'll make it through winter fine. It's next year that worries me if the market doesn't recover." He rubbed his face, exhausted. Morrison also mentioned something else. Said he'd heard I had a woman living here now. Made some comments about respectability and what people might think. Heat flushed Eleanor's face. "I see. I told him you were my fiancé and to keep his opinions to himself. Hope that's all right." Eleanor's heart skipped. "Your fiancé?" "It's going to come up eventually, if this partnership becomes what I think it might. People will talk either way, about you living here unmarried or about us marrying after such a short acquaintance. I figured we might as well control the narrative." He met her eyes. "Unless you object." No, I don't object. We haven't decided yet about making this permanent. I know, but Eleanor, I need to be honest with you. If we do this, if we get married, it's going to stir up trouble I haven't told you about." He took a breath. "My son, Richard, he's going to have opinions." "What kind of opinions?" "The kind that assume you're after my money. Richard and I haven't spoken since Kathy's funeral. He blamed me for her death, said I worked her too hard, didn't get her to doctors soon enough. Maybe he was right. But after she died, he left for San Francisco and only contacted me once, through a lawyer, asking if I planned to remarry and assuring me that any changes to my will would be contested." Eleanor felt cold spread through her chest. "He thinks I'm trying to steal his inheritance." "He'll think that, yes. Even though there's no inheritance to speak of beyond the ranch, and the ranch barely turns a profit most years." Thomas's voice was bitter. "Richard works for a banking firm in San Francisco. Makes more in a month than this place earns in a year, but he can't stand the thought of someone else having what he thinks is his, even though he has no interest in actually ranching." "Thomas, if this is going to cause a rift between you and your son, there's already a rift. Has been since he was 16 and decided ranch life wasn't good enough for him. Kathy kept the peace between us, but without her..." He shook his head. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you're walking into. If we marry, Richard will cause trouble. I can almost guarantee it." Eleanor thought about her own nephew, disappeared into the wilderness, and about the complicated ways family could wound and be wounded. "I appreciate the honesty. There's one more thing." Thomas pulled a letter from his pocket, creased from being folded and refolded. "This came 3 days ago. I wasn't going to mention it, but you should know. Richard's getting married, next month in San Francisco. I wasn't invited to the wedding, but his fiancée, Vivian is her name, sent this separately saying she'd like to meet me. Wants to heal the family breach, apparently. Are you going?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to see my son, even if he doesn't want to see me. Part of me thinks it would just make things worse." He looked at Eleanor. "What would you do?" Eleanor considered carefully. "I'd go. Not for Richard, if he doesn't want you there, but for yourself. So you know you tried. And maybe for this Vivian, who sounds like she's trying to build bridges. Would you come with me? If we're engaged, it would be appropriate, and I could use..." He stopped, started again. "I could use someone in my corner." The request was vulnerable in a way Eleanor hadn't expected from Thomas. She thought about what Clara had said, about partnership and not being alone, and made a decision that terrified and excited her in equal measure. "Yes, I'll come with you." Relief washed over Thomas's face. "Thank you. We'll leave next week. The trip will give us time to talk, really talk, about whether this partnership can work. Consider it part of the trial period." But Eleanor knew, somewhere deep in her bones, that she'd already decided. She just hadn't admitted it yet. The week before they left for San Francisco was organized chaos. Clara was managing on her own now, well enough that Eleanor felt comfortable leaving, though she prepared extra meals and left detailed instructions. Ben promised to watch over everything and to send word if anything went wrong with the ranch or with Duchess, who was recovering but still needed careful monitoring. Eleanor packed her meager belongings into a borrowed traveling case, acutely aware that her 2 worn dresses would look shabby in a city like San Francisco. Thomas noticed her hesitation and, without making a production of it, left money on her dresser with a note saying simply, "For the trip, buy what you need." She wanted to refuse on principle, but practicality won. She took the money to Carson Ridge and, with Joe's enthusiastic help, bought a simple but respectable traveling dress in deep blue wool and a hat that didn't look like it had been trampled by horses. Joe insisted on throwing in a shawl as a gift. "You're going to knock them dead," Joe declared, stepping back to admire Eleanor in the new outfit. "Thomas won't know what hit him." "It's not like that, Joe." "Sure it's not. That's why you're blushing." Eleanor was saved from responding by the shop bell. She changed back into her old dress, carefully folding the new one, and caught Joe watching her with unusual seriousness. "Eleanor, can I give you some advice? Not as a busybody, but as someone who cares?" "All right." "Thomas Calder is a good man, one of the best I've known, but he's carrying a lot of old hurt about his son. Don't let Richard poison what you and Thomas are building. Whatever happens in San Francisco, remember that you belong on that ranch now. You've earned your place there." The words settled into Eleanor like an anchor. "Thank you, Joe." "Don't thank me. Just be happy, and come back and tell me all about the wedding." The train to San Francisco took 2 days, winding through mountain passes and high desert before descending to the coast. Eleanor had never seen the ocean, and when it finally appeared through the train window, vast and gray and endless, she pressed her face to the glass like a child. Thomas smiled at her wonder. "Worth the trip?" "I had no idea it would be so big." Kathy said the same thing the first time she saw it. She grew up in Kansas, landlocked as they come. "We took a trip to San Diego for our 5th anniversary, and she stood on the beach for an hour just watching the waves." His voice was soft with memory. She kept saying it made her feel small, but not in a bad way. Like her problems were small too, compared to all that water. Eleanor understood that feeling exactly. "Do you miss her very much?" "Every day, but it's different now than it was. The first year, I missed her like I was missing a limb. Everything hurt all the time. Now it's more like, she's still here, in the way I think, the things I notice. I'll see something she would have loved, and I'll think Kathy would laugh at that. And it doesn't hurt the same way. It's more like company." "That's beautiful." Thomas looked at her then, his blue eyes direct. "I need you to know something, Eleanor. If we get married, I'm not trying to replace Kathy. I'm not looking for the same thing I had with her. She was my first love, my youth. What I'm offering you is different, older, maybe better in some ways because we know what we're getting into. We're not kids with romantic notions. We're just 2 people trying not to be alone." "Just 2 people," Eleanor repeated. "That sounds about right." They arrived in San Francisco in the evening, the city sprawling across hills in a confusion of buildings and lights that overwhelmed Eleanor's senses. Thomas hired a cab to take them to a modest hotel, where he'd reserved 2 rooms without discussion, respecting the boundary they'd established. Eleanor had never stayed in a hotel where someone else did the cleaning, served the meals, changed the linens. It felt strange and luxurious, and she found herself noticing every detail to tell Clara later. The wedding was the following afternoon. Thomas wore his one good suit, which he'd had cleaned and pressed by the hotel staff, and looked distinguished in a way Eleanor hadn't expected. She wore her new blue dress and felt, if not beautiful, at least presentable. They arrived at the church early, Thomas's jaw tight with tension. The building was elegant, all white stone and stained glass, the kind of place that spoke of old money and social position. Eleanor slipped her hand through Thomas's arm, and he covered her fingers with his own, grateful for the gesture. Richard arrived 15 minutes before the ceremony, flanked by a striking woman with auburn hair and sharp green eyes. He was tall like his father, but where Thomas was weathered oak, Richard was polished mahogany, city-refined and expensively dressed. His eyes, when they landed on Thomas, were cold as January. "Father, I didn't expect you to come." Vivian invited me. The auburn-haired woman stepped forward, her smile warm despite the tension crackling in the air. Mr. Calder, I'm so glad you made it. And you must be Eleanor. Richard's mentioned you. The way she said it suggested Richard's mentions had not been flattering. Eleanor kept her expression neutral. It's a pleasure to meet you, Vivian. Richard's gaze raked over Eleanor, assessing and dismissing her in one look. So it's true. You're actually engaged to her. Richard, Vivian said sharply. Don't. What? I'm just surprised Father moved on so quickly. Mother's barely been gone 3 years. Thomas's hand tightened on Eleanor's. This isn't the time or place for this discussion. No, you're right. This is my wedding day. I wouldn't want to ruin it with family drama. Richard's smile was a blade. We'll talk after the ceremony. I have some questions about your plans for the ranch. He walked away before Thomas could respond, leaving Vivian looking embarrassed and apologetic. I'm sorry. He's nervous about the wedding. He doesn't usually... Yes, he does, Thomas said quietly. But I appreciate you trying, Vivian. Truly. The ceremony was beautiful and brief, and Eleanor watched Vivian's face as she said her vows and saw genuine love there, which made her feel obscurely better about Richard. Anyone who loved that openly couldn't be completely lost. The reception was held at an expensive hotel, and Eleanor found herself navigating a world she'd only glimpsed from the servant's side. Champagne in crystal glasses, elaborate flower arrangements, women in silk and pearls. She felt conspicuous in her simple dress, but Thomas stayed close, his presence a bulwark against her discomfort. Richard found them during the toasts, pulling Thomas aside while Vivian engaged Eleanor in conversation about the ranch, her questions so genuine and interested that Eleanor found herself warming to her. Richard doesn't understand ranch life, Vivian confided. He thinks it's all cowboys and horses, very romantic. I've been trying to learn more so I can talk to Thomas about it. Richard acts like his father doesn't exist, but I can tell it hurts him. It hurts Thomas too, Eleanor said carefully. I know, that's why I wanted to fix this. Family shouldn't... Vivian stopped, her face suddenly pale as she looked past Eleanor. Oh no. Eleanor turned to see Richard and Thomas in heated conversation near the bar, voices rising despite the festive atmosphere. She moved closer, catching fragments. Suspicious timing, don't you think? Mother dies, and suddenly, Eleanor has nothing to do with your mother's death. But she has everything to do with you changing your will, I'm sure. How much is she getting, Father? Half? All of it? The ranch would go to you, as it always has. Not that you want it. I don't want the ranch. I want to make sure you're not being manipulated by some... Careful, Thomas said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Be very careful what you say next. Eleanor reached them just as Richard's face flushed with anger and something that looked almost like tears. She's not Mother. She'll never be Mother. And you're dishonoring her memory by replacing her so quickly. The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Thomas looked like he'd been struck, and Eleanor saw 3 years of grief and guilt and anger crystallize in his expression. Your mother, Thomas said slowly, told me on her deathbed not to die alone in that house. She made me promise to find someone to share my life with. She loved you, Richard, but she knew you'd never come back to the ranch. She wanted me to be happy, even if you can't be. That's convenient. Can't exactly ask her if that's true, can we? Richard! Vivian appeared at his elbow, her face stricken. Stop this. Now! But the damage was done. Thomas turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid, and Eleanor followed, catching him in the hotel lobby. He stood staring out at the San Francisco streets, his hands shaking. I'm sorry, he said hoarsely. I should have known this was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Richard needed to say those things, and you needed to hear them. Now you know where you stand. I know my son thinks I'm a fool being taken advantage of by a gold digger, he laughed bitterly. God, if he only knew, the ranch is worth more as land than as a working spread. If you were after money, you'd convince me to sell to Fletcher, not marry me. Eleanor took his arm, gently pulling him toward the door. Come on, let's go back to the hotel. We don't belong here. They walked through San Francisco's evening streets in silence, the city alive with noise and light around them. Back at the hotel, Thomas walked Eleanor to her room, and at the door he stopped. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Are you considering this partnership because you have no other options? Because if that's all this is, I'd rather know now." Eleanor met his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear of being used, of being alone. "A month ago, I would have said yes. I was desperate, Thomas. I would have taken any offer that kept me from starving. But now—" She paused, searching for honesty. "Now I'm choosing this, choosing you. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because when I saved Duchess, I felt like I mattered. Because when you teach me the ranch books, you listen to my opinions like they have value. Because when I wake up in that house, I feel like I'm home for the first time in years." "That's not romance," Thomas said softly. "No, it's better. It's real." Eleanor smiled. "I'm 61 years old, Thomas. I don't need flowers and poetry. I need a partner who won't disappear on me, who'll respect me, who'll let me be myself. You're offering me all of that. So yes, I'm choosing this. I'm choosing us." Thomas exhaled, and Eleanor saw the fear leave him, replaced by something that looked like hope. 3 months was supposed to help us decide. I don't need 3 months anymore. I know what I want. So do I. Then let's make it official. Let's get married. Eleanor felt her heart race, but her voice was steady. "Yes, let's get married." Thomas smiled then, really smiled, and Eleanor saw the man he must have been before grief carved lines into his face. "We'll do it properly. Small ceremony, just us and Clara and Ben. No fuss." "No fuss," Eleanor agreed. "Just partnership." He took her hand, raised it to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that made her breath catch. "Thank you, Eleanor, for taking a chance on this. Thank you for offering it." They said goodnight, and Eleanor went into her room feeling lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow they'd return to the ranch and begin planning their wedding. Tomorrow Richard's words would sting less. Tomorrow she'd wake up knowing she'd made a choice, not just accepted a necessity. But tonight, standing in her hotel room with the ocean breeze coming through the window, Eleanor Hayes allowed herself to feel something she'd thought long dead. Joy. They married on a Tuesday morning in November, with frost still clinging to the grass and the mountains sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The ceremony took place in the ranch house living room, presided over by a circuit judge who owed Thomas a favor and didn't ask questions about the speed of the courtship. Clara stood as witness, William asleep in her arms, and Ben signed the marriage certificate with a grin that suggested he'd known this was coming all along. Eleanor wore the blue dress from San Francisco and felt Thomas's hand shake slightly when he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. His own ring, Kathy's wedding band, resized to fit, sat warm against her skin, a symbol of continuity rather than replacement. When the judge pronounced them married, Thomas kissed her cheek with the restraint of a man still learning the boundaries of this new relationship, and Eleanor felt something settle in her chest that might have been peace. They celebrated with the dinner Eleanor had prepared the day before, Clara having insisted that no woman should cook on her wedding day. The 4 adults ate roast chicken and potatoes while William fussed in his cradle, and they toasted with coffee since none of them cared much for spirits. It was simple and honest and exactly what Eleanor wanted. That night, Thomas walked Eleanor to her room, still her room, not theirs, by mutual unspoken agreement, and paused at the door. "This doesn't change anything unless you want it to," he said quietly. "We're partners first. Everything else can wait." Eleanor appreciated the consideration even as part of her wondered if they were being foolish. 2 older people tiptoeing around each other like nervous children. But Thomas was right. They had time. They had the rest of their lives to figure out what this marriage meant beyond the practical partnership they'd agreed to. "Good night, husband," she said, testing the word. Thomas smiled. "Good night, wife." The title felt strange for days afterward, like a coat that didn't quite fit but might with wearing. Eleanor was now Eleanor Calder, a name that sounded solid and permanent in a way Eleanor Hayes never had. She was a rancher's wife, a stepmother to a son who despised her, and a partner in an enterprise she was still learning to understand. The ranch demanded constant attention as winter approached. Cattle had to be moved to lower pastures, hay had to be distributed, fences needed reinforcing against the weight of snow that would inevitably come. Thomas taught Eleanor to ride properly, not the side saddle nonsense of her youth, but astride like a working ranch hand, and she discovered that at 61 she could still learn new skills that left her muscles screaming and her pride intact. Ben treated her the same as always, which Eleanor appreciated more than any deference would have warranted. Clara, however, grew quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours in her room with William while Eleanor managed the household. At first, Eleanor attributed it to the exhaustion of new motherhood, but as weeks passed, Clara's silences felt heavier, weighted with something Eleanor couldn't name. She found Clara crying in the kitchen one morning, William nursing contentedly while tears streamed down his mother's face. "Clara, what's wrong?" "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." Clara wiped her eyes with her free hand. "I should be happy. I have a healthy baby, a good husband, a home, but I feel like I'm drowning, Eleanor, like I'm disappearing into taking care of everyone else and there's nothing left of me." Eleanor sat down beside her, remembering her own years of being swallowed by other people's needs. "Have you told Ben?" "How can I? He works so hard, and he's so proud of William. I can't tell him I'm miserable when I have everything I'm supposed to want." "You're not miserable. You're exhausted and overwhelmed, and that's different. That's normal." Eleanor touched Clara's shoulder gently. "Let me take William this afternoon. You sleep or read or just stare at the wall if that's what you need. You can't pour from an empty cup, Clara." "But the house—" "We'll survive without you for a few hours. I've been managing it fine." Something flickered across Clara's face then, something that looked almost like resentment before she locked it away. "Yes, you have. You've been managing everything very well." Eleanor felt the shift like cold water down her spine. "Clara, I'm sorry, I'm just tired. Thank you for offering to watch William. I'll take you up on that." But after Clara left, Eleanor stood in the kitchen wondering what she'd missed, what undercurrent she'd failed to notice. She thought about how she'd taken over the household so completely, how she'd reorganized and improved and made everything run more efficiently. She'd thought she was helping. Had she instead made Clara feel useless in her own home? The question gnawed at her through the afternoon as she cared for William, changed his diapers, walked him through his fussy periods. When Ben came in for supper, she pulled him aside. "Is Clara all right? Really all right?" Ben's expression clouded. "She's struggling. Won't talk to me about it, but I can see it. She used to run this house, managed everything while I was out working. Now you're here, and you're better at it than she was, and I think—" He stopped, choosing words carefully. "I think she feels like she doesn't have a place anymore." The words hit Eleanor like a punch. "I never meant— I was just trying to help." "I know, and you have helped tremendously. But maybe Clara needs to feel needed too, not just as William's mother, but as someone who contributes to the ranch." Eleanor thought about this through supper, through the evening chores, through the quiet hour before bed when Thomas reviewed the day's work and planned for tomorrow. Finally, she went to Clara's room and knocked softly. Clara answered with William on her hip, her face wary. "Yes? Can we talk? Really talk?" They sat in Clara's small sitting area, William playing on a blanket between them, and Eleanor chose her words with care. "I've been thoughtless. I came into your home and took over without considering how that might make you feel. This was your house before I arrived, and I've been acting like it's mine." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You've been wonderful, Eleanor. Everything runs so smoothly now. I should be grateful. But instead you feel displaced. I understand that. I felt the same way when my husband died and his sister came to help me manage the store. She meant well, but she made me feel incompetent in my own life." Eleanor leaned forward, deceit. "I don't want to do that to you, Clara. This is your home too. It always will be. So tell me, what would make this better?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, tears tracking down her face. "I need to still be useful, not just to William, but to the ranch. I need to feel like I matter beyond being a mother." "You do matter. Tell me how I can help you feel that." They talked for an hour, negotiating territory and responsibilities, finding ways to share the household rather than divide it. Clara would manage the kitchen again, with Eleanor helping but not taking over. Eleanor would handle the ranch bookkeeping and correspondence, which Clara admitted she'd always found tedious. They would split the cleaning and laundry, work together on preserving and canning, make decisions jointly about household purchases. By the time Eleanor left, Clara was smiling again, and Eleanor felt she'd narrowly avoided destroying a friendship she valued more than she'd realized. "You talked to Clara," Thomas said later, when they were alone in his office reviewing invoices. "How did you know?" "She hugged me after supper. First time in weeks she seemed like herself." He set down his pen, looking at Eleanor with those steady blue eyes. "Thank you for seeing what needed fixing and fixing it. Not everyone would have. I almost broke something important through pure thoughtlessness. That's nothing to be proud of. But you noticed and you corrected it. That takes wisdom, Eleanor, and humility." He reached across the desk and took her hand, a gesture that was becoming more common between them, more natural. "You're going to be all right at this. Being a partner, being part of this family." Eleanor squeezed his fingers, hoping he was right. December brought snow and a letter from San Francisco, delivered by a ranch hand returning from town. Thomas opened it at the dinner table, his face going carefully blank as he read. "Richard," he said simply, handing the letter to Eleanor. The handwriting was educated, precise, and cold as the snow falling outside. Richard informed his father that he and Vivian would be visiting the ranch after Christmas, ostensibly to see the property and discuss future arrangements. The subtext was clear. Richard wanted to inspect Eleanor to assess the threat she posed to his eventual inheritance and to make his displeasure known. "Let him come," Eleanor said, handing the letter back. "We have nothing to hide. He'll be cruel to you. I've survived worse than a bitter son's disapproval." Eleanor met Thomas's worried gaze. "I'm not afraid of Richard." But when Clara read the letter, her face went pale. "Eleanor, you don't understand. Richard can be vicious when he feels threatened. And Vivian, she seemed nice at the wedding, but she's his wife. She'll support whatever he does." "Then we'll face them together," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. The weeks before Christmas were consumed with preparation. Eleanor threw herself into making the house perfect, some part of her needing to prove she belonged here, that she'd earned her place. She cleaned and polished and baked, filled the house with the scent of pine and cinnamon, helped Thomas select gifts for Clara and Ben and baby William. Thomas gave Eleanor a new winter coat, thick wool lined with rabbit fur, practical and warm. She gave him a pocket watch to replace the one that had stopped working 2 years ago, engraved simply with their wedding date. They exchanged these gifts privately, in his office, and Eleanor saw Thomas's hands shake as he opened the watch. "Kathy gave me my first watch when we married," he said quietly. "I wore it until the day she died. I couldn't bring myself to replace it because it felt like replacing her." "This isn't replacing anything," Eleanor said. "It's just marking something new, something ours." Thomas pulled her into an embrace then, the first real one they'd shared, and Eleanor felt the solid warmth of him, the strength and the vulnerability. They stood there for a long moment, learning the shape of each other before Thomas pulled back and cleared his throat. "Thank you, Eleanor, for understanding what this means. Thank you for letting me be part of it." Christmas was quiet and good, shared with Clara and Ben and William, who was just beginning to smile at faces he recognized. They ate too much, laughed at Ben's terrible jokes, and watched the snow fall outside like a blessing. And then Richard arrived. He came 2 days after Christmas, riding up in a hired carriage with Vivian beside him, both dressed in expensive traveling clothes that looked absurd against the ranch's rustic backdrop. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Thomas went out to greet them, saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the careful distance he maintained from his son. Richard had Vivian's hand on his arm like a claim of ownership, and his eyes swept over the ranch with the assessing gaze of someone calculating value. When Thomas led them inside, Eleanor was ready, standing in the living room with Clara beside her, presenting a united front. "Richard, Vivian, welcome." Eleanor kept her voice warm but not obsequious. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "Mrs. Calder." Richard's use of her married name was pointed, mocking. "How domestic you look. Plain house must suit you." "Richard," Vivian said sharply, but he ignored her. "Where are you putting us? I assume the master bedroom is still Mother's shrine." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You and Vivian will have the guest room. It's been prepared for you." "How thoughtful. Did your new wife handle that, or do you still have actual staff?" Eleanor felt Clara stiffen beside her, but she kept her own expression neutral. I prepared the room myself. I hope you'll find it comfortable. I'm sure it will be adequate. Richard removed his coat, handing it to Eleanor as if she were a servant. Now, Father, shall we discuss the ranch's finances? I'd like to review the books, see how things are being managed. The books are in order, Thomas said. Eleanor has been helping me organize them. Richard's laugh was harsh. I'm sure she has. How convenient for you both. The next 3 days were a battlefield disguised as a family visit. Richard picked apart everything, the condition of the fences, the quality of the cattle, the efficiency of Ben's work. He questioned every expense in the ledgers, implied mismanagement at every turn, and treated Eleanor with a contempt that bordered on cruelty. Vivian tried to soften his attacks, pulling Eleanor aside to apologize, but even she seemed powerless to control her husband's anger. He's not usually like this, she said quietly on the second day. It's just, he loved his mother so much, and seeing someone else in her place. I'm not trying to take her place, Eleanor said for what felt like the 100th time. I know, but Richard doesn't see it that way. He sees you as an interloper, someone taking advantage of his father's grief and loneliness. Vivian's green eyes were troubled. I've tried to make him see reason, but he won't listen. He's convinced you convinced Thomas to change his will. The will hasn't been changed. The ranch still goes to Richard. I know, I told him that, but he thinks it's only a matter of time. Vivian looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape. He wants Thomas to sell the ranch to that Fletcher person. Take the money and move to San Francisco, somewhere Richard can keep an eye on him. Eleanor felt cold spread through her chest. Thomas would never. Richard thinks he can convince him. He's already been in contact with Fletcher's people. The revelation hung between them like a grenade, and Eleanor knew she had to tell Thomas immediately. But before she could act, Clara burst into the room, her face white with panic. Eleanor, come quick! Something's wrong with the barn! They ran outside to find smoke billowing from the structure, thick and black against the white snow. Thomas and Ben were already there, throwing open the doors to release the panicked horses while flames licked up the interior walls. Richard stood at a safe distance, Vivian clutching his arm, both of them watching the chaos with expressions Eleanor couldn't read. Get buckets, Thomas shouted. We need water. Eleanor and Clara formed a bucket brigade with 2 ranch hands, passing water from the pump while Thomas and Ben worked to contain the blaze. The heat was intense even in the freezing air, and Eleanor's lungs burned from smoke. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. This was her home now, her life, and she'd be damned if she'd watch it burn. It took 2 hours to get the fire under control, and by then the barn was half destroyed, 3 horses injured, and everyone coated in soot and ash. Thomas stood surveying the damage, his face a mask of exhausted fury, and when he turned to Ben, his voice was hoarse. How did this start? I don't know. I checked everything this morning. The lanterns were all extinguished. No hot ashes in the stove. It doesn't make sense. Eleanor's eyes found Richard and Vivian, still standing at that safe distance, and saw Vivian's face crumple with what looked like guilt. She moved toward them, her heart hammering, and Richard's expression shuddered immediately. What a tragedy, he said, his voice carrying just enough false sympathy to be insulting. I suppose this will hurt the ranch's value significantly. Perhaps selling to Fletcher is the sensible option now. The words confirmed Eleanor's suspicions even before Vivian's sharp intake of breath, the way she pulled away from Richard's arm as if burned. Eleanor looked at Vivian's face and saw the truth written there. This was no accident. What did you do? Eleanor asked quietly. I didn't do anything, Richard said, but his eyes flickered toward Vivian. Vivian. Eleanor kept her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. Tell me what happened. Vivian was crying now, shaking her head. I didn't mean. I thought the barn was empty. Richard said if the barn burned, Thomas would see reason, would understand the ranch was too much trouble. He said no one would get hurt. It was just a building. You set the fire. The words came from Thomas, flat and terrible, and when Eleanor turned, she saw something in his face she'd never seen before. Not anger, devastation. Richard stepped between Vivian and Thomas, his expression defiant despite the tremor in his voice. You're being dramatic, Father. It was a warning, that's all, to show you what happens when you're too stubborn to get out. Father, get out. Thomas's voice was quiet but absolute. Take your wife and leave my property. You're not welcome here anymore. You can't be serious. I'm your son. You burned my barn. You could have killed those horses. You put Eleanor and Clara and Ben at risk because you wanted to prove a point about money you don't even need. Thomas took a step forward, and Richard actually backed up. You're not my son anymore. A son wouldn't do this. A son would care about something beyond his own greed. Fine. Richard's face twisted with rage and pain. Fine, but don't expect me to come running when you realize she's stolen everything from you. Don't expect me to forgive you for choosing some desperate old woman over your own family. Thomas moved so fast, Eleanor barely saw it, his hand gripping Richard's collar. You speak about my wife with respect, or you don't speak at all. Eleanor saved Duchess's life when she was dying. She manages this ranch better than I could alone. She's shown me more loyalty in 3 months than you've shown in 3 years. So yes, Richard, I choose her. I will always choose her, because she chose to stay when you chose to leave. He released Richard with a shove that sent him stumbling backward. Vivian was sobbing openly now, and Eleanor felt a strange pity for her despite everything. She'd been used by Richard, manipulated into an act she clearly regretted, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. Thomas, Vivian said through her tears, I'm so sorry. I never wanted... Richard said it would just convince you to be reasonable. I didn't know. Go. Thomas's voice was gentler with her, but still firm. Just go. They watched Richard and Vivian gather their belongings and climb into the carriage, watched them drive away down the snow-covered road until they disappeared from sight. Then Thomas turned and walked toward what remained of the barn, and Eleanor followed, giving him space but staying close enough to matter. He stood looking at the blackened timbers, the destroyed hay stores, the months of work now reduced to ash. We can rebuild, he said finally. It'll cost us, but we can do it. Yes, Eleanor agreed. We can rebuild. Thomas turned to her then, his face streaked with soot and tears he didn't bother to hide. He's really gone. My son. I always thought maybe someday we'd find our way back to each other, but after this, I know. Eleanor took his hand, not caring that they were both filthy, that Clara and Ben were watching from the house. I'm sorry, Thomas. I know what it's like to lose family. I didn't lose him. He left. There's a difference. Thomas looked down at their joined hands. But I still have you. That counts for something. It counts for everything, Eleanor said fiercely. We're going to get through this. We're going to rebuild the barn and continue running this ranch, and we're going to do it together. That's what partners do. Thomas pulled her into an embrace, and Eleanor held him while he grieved for the son he'd just lost forever, while he processed the betrayal and the violence and the relief of choosing himself for once. She held him until the sun began to set, painting the snow orange and gold, until Clara called them in for supper, until the immediate crisis softened into the long work of recovery. That night, after everyone had eaten and the house had settled into exhausted quiet, Thomas came to Eleanor's room. He knocked softly, and when she opened the door, he stood there with an expression she couldn't quite read. Can I stay? He asked. Not for... I just don't want to be alone tonight. Eleanor opened the door wider, and Thomas came in, sitting on the edge of her bed with the weariness of a man who'd aged a decade in a single day. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching, and they stayed that way for a long time without speaking. Finally, Thomas said, I told Richard I chose you. I meant it. I know. But Eleanor, you should know, I'm not choosing you instead of him. I'm choosing you alongside everything else I am. The ranch, the memories of Kathy, the hope that maybe Richard will come back someday, even though I know he won't. I'm choosing all of it, and you're part of that now, an essential part. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. That's all I ever wanted, to be part of something real. Thomas took her hand, and this time when he kissed her, it wasn't on the cheek but on the mouth, gentle and searching and full of the careful tenderness of people who'd both been broken and were learning to be whole again. When they pulled apart, Eleanor saw in his eyes something that looked like love, or the beginning of it, and she thought maybe, just maybe, this partnership they'd built on practical foundations was becoming something neither of them had expected, something that might actually last. That kiss changed something fundamental between them, though neither Eleanor nor Thomas spoke of it directly. The next morning, they woke in Eleanor's bed, fully clothed and tangled together like survivors of a shipwreck, and Thomas's first words were, "We need to assess the barn damage before the snow gets worse." Eleanor appreciated his practicality even as she mourned the loss of the quiet intimacy they'd shared in darkness. But this was who they were, people who faced problems head-on, who didn't hide from hard truths behind pretty words. So she rose and dressed and met him in the kitchen where Clara was already making coffee, baby William fussing in his cradle. "Ben's out surveying what's salvageable," Clara said, handing them each a cup. Her eyes lingered on Thomas's face, reading the exhaustion there, then moved to Eleanor with something that might have been respect. "He thinks we lost about half the structure, most of the hay stores, and the tack room completely. The horses that got out are mostly fine, just spooked. Could have been so much worse." "It was meant to be worse," Thomas said quietly. "Richard wanted the whole thing gone. He just didn't count on us fighting back." They spent the morning in the ruins, salvaging what they could, charred tools that might be cleaned and repaired, undamaged lumber from the sections that hadn't caught, hardware and nails scattered in the ash. Eleanor worked alongside the men, her hands blackening with soot, and discovered a strange satisfaction in the physical labor of recovery. Every board they saved was a small victory over Richard's cruelty, proof that his attempt to destroy them had failed. By noon, Wade Morrison appeared on horseback, Harold Fletcher himself riding beside him. Fletcher was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and an air of barely contained triumph. He dismounted and surveyed the damaged barn with the satisfaction of a vulture spotting carrion. "Thomas," he said, his voice oily with false sympathy, "heard about your misfortune. Terrible thing. Fires. They can ruin a man." Thomas straightened from his work, facing Fletcher with the wary stillness of a man confronting a predator. "What do you want, Harold?" "To help, of course. This barn's going to cost you, what, $3,000 to rebuild? Maybe $4, with lumber prices what they are. That's money you don't have, not with cattle prices down and winter eating into your reserves." Fletcher pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for the property. Today. Cash. You and your new wife can start fresh somewhere else, maybe somewhere easier to manage." The answer is still no. Thomas, be reasonable. You're 64 years old with a half-destroyed ranch and a son who clearly wants nothing to do with the place. What's the point of holding on? Eleanor watched Thomas's hands clench and knew he was close to doing something violent. She stepped forward, placing herself between the two men, and addressed Fletcher directly. "Mr. Fletcher, I'm Eleanor Calder, Thomas's wife and partner in this ranch. I think you should know that we're fully aware Richard has been in contact with your people, that this fire was likely meant to soften us up for your offer." She smiled without warmth. "It hasn't worked. If anything, it's made us more determined to stay. So you can take your $5,000 and your opportunistic sympathy and leave our property." Fletcher's eyes narrowed, reassessing her. "You're the new wife. The one who appeared out of nowhere right before Thomas suddenly decided to get married. Convenient timing, don't you think? I think my marriage is none of your business. I also think attempting to buy property from people in distress makes you a vulture, not a businessman. Now leave." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, but Fletcher just laughed. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't rebuild barns or feed cattle through winter. When you're ready to be realistic, Thomas, you know where to find me." They watched Fletcher and Morrison ride away, and Thomas let out a breath he'd been holding. "That was either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Eleanor admitted, "but I meant what I said. We're not giving up." "We're not," Thomas agreed, and the "we" felt like bedrock under Eleanor's feet. The work of rebuilding consumed the next month. Thomas hired 2 additional ranch hands and a carpenter from Carson Ridge, and together they began the slow process of reconstruction. Money was tight, tighter than Eleanor had realized, and she found herself poring over the ledgers late into the night, looking for expenses to cut, ways to stretch their resources. Joe visited one afternoon bringing supplies and gossip, her eyes widening when she saw the barn damage. "Lord have mercy, Eleanor. Clara wrote me about the fire, but I didn't realize it was this bad. It could have been worse. We saved the horses, most of the tools. We're managing." "I heard it was Thomas's son who said it. That true?" Eleanor hesitated, but Joe had become a friend, and friends deserved honesty. His wife did it, on Richard's orders. They thought it would convince Thomas to sell. Joe's expression hardened. That boy needs his backside tanned, grown or not. What kind of son tries to destroy his father's livelihood? The kind who's more interested in inheritance than family. Eleanor poured them both coffee, grateful for the company. But Thomas is better off without him, I think. Richard was poison, had been for years. And you? How are you holding up in all this? Eleanor considered the question carefully. 2 months ago, she would have said she was merely surviving, going through the motions of partnership without feeling its reality. But now, covered in sawdust and bone-tired from manual labor, managing accounts that didn't quite balance and a household that never stopped demanding attention, she realized something had shifted. "I'm happy," she said, surprised by the truth of it. "I know that sounds insane given everything, but I am. I have purpose here. I matter. When I wake up, I know what I'm working toward, and it's something real and mine." Joe's smile was knowing. "And Thomas? How are things with him?" Heat crept up Eleanor's neck. "We're partners, good partners. Honey, I've seen the way that man looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. That's not partnership. That's something deeper." Eleanor couldn't deny it, not to Joe. "It's complicated. We started this as a practical arrangement, and now it's becoming something else. But we're both scared, I think. Scared of wanting too much, of losing what we've built. Fear's natural, but don't let it stop you from living, Eleanor. You've been given a second chance at something real. Take it." The words stayed with Eleanor long after Joe left, echoing through her thoughts as she worked beside Thomas, ate meals with him, fell asleep knowing he was just down the hall. They were dancing around each other, she realized, two people who wanted more but didn't know how to ask for it. The breakthrough came on a February evening, bitter cold and clear, stars sharp as broken glass overhead. Eleanor was checking on Duchess, who'd fully recovered but still received extra attention, when Thomas joined her in the rebuilt section of the barn. "She looks good," he said, running a hand down the mare's neck. "You saved her life, you know. I never properly thanked you for that." "You've thanked me a dozen times." "Not for what it meant to me, though. Duchess was Kathy's favorite. Saving her, it felt like you were honoring Kathy's memory, not trying to erase it." Thomas turned to face Eleanor fully. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Eleanor's heart began to race. "All right. When I asked you to marry me, it was practical. A business arrangement between two lonely people. I thought that's all it would be, all I wanted it to be. I wasn't looking for love. I'd had that with Kathy, and I thought that was my one chance." He took a breath. "But Eleanor, somewhere between you saving my horse and rebuilding my barn and standing up to Fletcher, I fell in love with you. Not the same way I loved Kathy. This is different, quieter, built on different foundations, but it's real, and it's terrifying, and I need to know if you feel anything close to the same." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, you don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know, needed you to understand that this isn't just partnership for me anymore. It's more. You're more." "You ridiculous man," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I've been in love with you since you taught me the ranch books and actually listened to my opinions like they mattered. I've been terrified to admit it because I thought you were still in love with Kathy's ghost, and I could never compete with that." Thomas cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. "You're not competing. You're building something new with me. Something that's ours." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Eleanor felt 61 years of loneliness crack open to let in light. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I want you to move into my room. Our room. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep knowing you're there. I want this to be a real marriage in every way." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes to all of it." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Eleanor felt something settle in her chest that she'd been missing her entire life. Not just love, though that was there, but belonging. The bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Clara noticed the change immediately, her knowing smile spreading across her face at breakfast the next morning, when Thomas pulled Eleanor's chair out for her and kissed the top of her head before sitting down himself. About time, Clara said. Ben and I had a bet going on how long it would take you two to figure it out. I won. You bet on us? Eleanor asked, torn between amusement and outrage. Someone had to. You were both so busy being noble and careful that you were going to wait until you were 90. Clara bounced William on her knee. Life's too short for that nonsense. The winter thawed into spring, and with it came new growth in more ways than one. The barn was completed in March, stronger than before, built with lessons learned from the fire. Eleanor's garden, planted with Clara's enthusiastic help, began showing green shoots. The cattle were moved to summer pastures, calves were born, and the ranch hummed with the busy purpose of life renewing itself. In April, a letter arrived from San Francisco. Eleanor found it on the hall table and recognized Vivian's handwriting immediately. She brought it to Thomas in his office, where he was reviewing breeding records, and watched his face as he read. She's left him, Thomas said finally. Vivian, she left Richard 2 months ago, filed for divorce. Says she couldn't stay married to someone who valued money over integrity, who would hurt his own father for an inheritance he didn't need. He looked up at Eleanor. She's asking if she can visit. Says she wants to apologize in person, to try to make amends for her part in the fire. What do you want to do? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I want to say yes, not because I forgive what she did, but because she's trying to do the right thing now, and because he stopped, struggling with something. Because if she left Richard, he's alone. And despite everything, he's still my son. Maybe if I show Vivian grace, somehow it helps him too. Eleanor understood the complicated love of difficult family. Then we'll invite her. We'll hear what she has to say. Vivian arrived in May, thinner than Eleanor remembered, with shadows under her green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard decisions. She stood on the rebuilt porch with her traveling case and looked at Thomas with an expression of such raw remorse that Eleanor felt her heart twist. Thank you for letting me come, Vivian said. I wasn't sure you would. Come inside, Thomas said simply. You've traveled a long way. Over the next 3 days, Vivian told them everything. How Richard had become obsessed with the ranch after Kathy's death, convinced Thomas would remarry and cheat him of his inheritance. How he'd manipulated Vivian into setting the fire, telling her it would just be a warning, that no one would get hurt. How she'd realized afterward what she'd done, what she'd become by following Richard's twisted logic. I loved him, she said on the second evening, sitting in the living room with Eleanor while Thomas was out checking the horses. I really did. But he made me into someone I didn't recognize, someone who could commit arson and justify it as protecting our future. Tears tracked down her face. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know. I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just so blind. Eleanor thought about her own blindness over the years, the ways she'd let herself be used by James, by her late husband, by anyone who needed something from her. We all make mistakes. The question is what we do after. I'm trying to do better. I got a job in San Francisco, found a small apartment. I'm building a life that's mine, not defined by who I married. Vivian smiled weakly. It's terrifying and lonely, and the best thing I've ever done. Good, Eleanor said firmly. That's good. Before Vivian left, Thomas took her aside. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as they talked in the yard, saw Thomas hand Vivian an envelope, saw her try to refuse before finally accepting it. When Thomas came back inside, he looked lighter somehow. What did you give her? Eleanor asked. Money. Enough to help her get established. She didn't want to take it, said she didn't deserve it after what she did. But I told her that's not how grace works. You don't earn it, you just receive it and try to do better. Eleanor pulled him into an embrace. You're a good man, Thomas Calder. I'm a man who's been given more second chances than he deserves. Seemed only fair to pass one along. Summer brought prosperity. Cattle prices recovered, and Thomas sold his yearlings for more than projected. The ranch made actual profit for the first time in 3 years, and Thomas insisted on splitting it with Eleanor, putting half in an account in her name alone. This is yours, he said when she protested. Partner means equal. Equal means you get your share of the profits to do with as you please. Save it, spend it, burn it if you want. It's yours. Eleanor deposited the money and felt, for the first time in her adult life, financially secure. Not dependent on anyone else's charity or goodwill, but genuinely independent. The freedom of it was dizzying. She used part of it to surprise Clara with a new sewing machine, the kind Clara had admired in a catalog but never thought she'd own. Clara cried and hugged her and declared Eleanor the best sister she'd never had. The friendship between them had deepened into something Eleanor treasured more than she could express, the kind of bond between women who'd survived hard things together and come out stronger. Ben built an addition onto the house that summer, creating a proper nursery for William and freeing up space for the household to breathe. One evening, as Eleanor watched the construction from the porch, Clara joined her with 2 glasses of lemonade. "You've transformed this place," Clara said. "Not just the house, but all of it. Thomas is happier than I've seen him since Kathy died. The ranch is thriving. Even the land seems more alive." "That's not me. That's all of us working together." "Maybe. But you're the center that holds it all. You're the one who makes this feel like a family instead of just people sharing space." Clara clinked her glass against Eleanor's. "I'm glad you collapsed in Carson Ridge that day. Glad Joe dragged you into the diner. Glad you said yes to Thomas's crazy proposal." Eleanor thought back to that moment in the dust, her last $11 in her pocket, her nephew lost, her life seemingly over. If someone had told her then where she'd be a year later, she would have thought them mad. "So am I," she said quietly. "So am I." Autumn painted the mountains gold and red, and Eleanor celebrated her 62nd birthday with a small party that somehow grew to include half of Carson Ridge. Joe came with a chocolate cake that was slightly lopsided but delicious. The circuit judge who'd married them appeared with a bottle of whiskey. Even the ranch hands gathered in the yard, sharing food and stories as the sun set over the land. Thomas presented Eleanor with a gift wrapped in brown paper, his expression nervous in a way that made her heart tender. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. "For your story," he said. "I know you've lived through things worth remembering, worth writing down. I thought maybe you'd want a place to put them." Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth leather, thinking about all the stories she carried. Margaret and James, the boarding house years, the collapse in Carson Ridge, the journey to this moment. "Thank you. I'll treasure this. There's one more thing." Thomas pulled out a folded document, legal and official looking. "I've updated my will. The ranch goes to both of us jointly, and after we're gone, it passes to Clara and Ben's children. Richard is specifically excluded unless he makes genuine amends, and even then, he only gets a cash settlement, not the land. I wanted you to know that your future is secure here, Eleanor. This is your home for as long as you want it." Eleanor felt tears spill over. "Thomas, I know we started this as a practical arrangement, but you're my wife, my partner, my love. You deserve to know that I'm committed to building a life with you, not just for now, but for whatever time we have left." She kissed him there in front of everyone, not caring about propriety or who was watching, and the gathered crowd cheered. When they pulled apart, Eleanor saw Clara wiping her eyes, Ben grinning, Joe looking satisfied as a cat with cream. Winter came again, fierce and clean, and Eleanor discovered she loved the cold months on the ranch. She loved watching snow fall over the mountains, loved the way the house felt cozy and protected against the elements, loved the long evenings by the fire with Thomas reading aloud while she mended or worked on her journal. She was writing about her life, as Thomas had suggested. Not just the hard parts, but all of it. The love and loss, the mistakes and miracles, the long journey from that boarding house in St. Louis to this ranch in Colorado. She wrote about Margaret and James, giving them life on the page, even though they were gone from it in reality. She wrote about the day she collapsed in Carson Ridge and Joe's rough kindness saved her. She wrote about Thomas's proposal and their awkward early partnership and the moment she realized she was falling in love. "What are you going to do with it when it's finished?" Thomas asked one evening, looking over her shoulder at the filled pages. "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe just keep it so someone knows we existed, that this life mattered." Eleanor set down her pen. "Or maybe I'll give it to William someday, when he's old enough to understand that families are built, not just born into. He's lucky to have you as an aunt. I'm lucky to have him, to have all of this." Eleanor gestured to encompass the house, the ranch, the life they'd built. "A year and a half ago, I had nothing. Now I have everything that matters. In February, a year after Vivian's visit, another letter arrived from San Francisco. This time it was from Richard, and Thomas stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Eleanor read over his shoulder, her hand on his back for support. The letter was brief and stiff, Richard's pride evident in every carefully chosen word, but beneath the formality was something that might have been regret. He wrote that he'd heard about the ranch's recovery, about Eleanor's role in making it profitable. He wrote that Vivian's divorce had forced him to examine his own choices, his own values. He wrote that he wasn't ready to apologize yet, but he wanted Thomas to know that he was trying to understand why he'd done what he'd done. "It's not much," Thomas said when he finished reading, "but it's something. More than I expected. Do you want to respond?" "Eventually, not yet. Let him sit with it for a while, figure out if he really means it or if he's just feeling guilty." Thomas folded the letter carefully. "But Eleanor, whatever happens with Richard, whether he comes around or doesn't, I want you to know that you're my priority. You and this life we've built. He had his chance to be part of this family, and he chose differently. I'm not closing the door completely, but I'm not waiting for him either." "Good," Eleanor said, "because I'm not going anywhere." Spring brought new life again. Clara announced she was pregnant with her second child, due in the fall. Duchess foaled a strong colt that Thomas named Eleanor over her protests, saying the horse had her stubbornness and spirit. The garden exploded with vegetables, and Eleanor spent happy hours teaching William to pull weeds and water seedlings, watching him grow into a bright, curious child who called her Aunt Ellie with the unself-conscious affection of the very young. One May morning, Eleanor woke before Thomas and slipped out to the porch to watch the sunrise. The land stretched before her in rolling waves of green and gold, cattle grazing in the distance, the mountains sharp against a sky turning pink and orange. She thought about the woman who'd collapsed in the street 18 months ago, broken and desperate and convinced her life was over. That woman would never have believed she could be happy, would never have imagined she could fall in love at 61, could learn to ride and manage accounts and rebuild barns, would never have dreamed she'd find a family in Colorado, would stand on a porch watching sunrise over land she owned as an equal partner. But here she was, Eleanor Calder, wife, partner, aunt, friend, home. Thomas found her there, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and pulling her against his chest. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day begin, and Eleanor realized she'd stopped asking the question that had haunted her since St. Louis. She'd stopped wondering if she mattered, if she had value, if anyone would notice when she disappeared. Because she knew the answer now. She mattered here. Her work had value. And when she was gone, many years from now, she hoped, she would leave behind more than just absence. She would leave behind a ranch that thrived, a family that loved her, a story worth telling. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, his voice rumbling in his chest. Eleanor leaned back against him, solid and warm and real. "I'm thinking about belonging, about how the question was never really about finding shelter or even finding work. It was about finding where I fit." "And have you? Found where you fit?" Eleanor looked out over the ranch, at Clara emerging from the house with William on her hip, at Ben heading to the barn, at the life they'd all built together through hard work and grace and the stubborn refusal to give up. She thought about Joe in town, about Vivian building a new life in San Francisco, about Richard maybe finding his way back to humanity. She thought about all the broken pieces of her past and how they'd somehow formed a foundation for this impossible, beautiful present. "Yes," she said simply. "I found exactly where I fit." Thomas kissed the top of her head, and they stood together watching the sun climb higher, watching the ranch wake and stir, watching their life unfold in the ordinary magic of another day. The wind carried the scent of fresh hay and coffee and the sweet promise of summer coming. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. William laughed at something Clara said. The house behind them hummed with the quiet contentment of a home well-loved and well-lived in. Eleanor Hayes had come to Colorado looking for the last remaining member of her family and found instead that family was something you built from courage and choice and the willingness to try again when everything seemed lost. She'd come with nothing but dust and desperation and $11 she'd counted like prayer. She'd found everything that mattered, And in the golden light of a Colorado morning, standing on her porch beside the man she loved, Eleanor finally understood what she'd been searching for all along. Not rescue, not charity, not even security, though that helped. Just the simple, profound gift of being seen, of being chosen, of being home. The story that had begun with a fall in the dust had become something else entirely. A story of rebuilding, of second chances, of two people who'd lost everything finding each other and discovering that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. And this beginning, Eleanor thought, as Thomas took her hand and led her inside to breakfast, to family, to the day's work waiting to be done. This beginning was worth every hard mile she'd traveled to reach it.